Hello. All right. Here's 6.6. This is the section of the four sections within this. We'll go 6.5, 6.6, 2.8, 2.9. So this is about hormones, homeostasis, and reproduction. And you might be like, what does this have to do with neurons? Why are we talking about these back to back? It's because neurons are all about communication, but very specific communication, whereas hormones are about big messages that go throughout your body. So if I want to tell this muscle to move my thumb, I send a neuron sends a signal, that action potential, down to this specific muscle to move it. Okay, that's a message. It's a very specific message. If I want to send a message to every cell in my body, there's a scary bear running after me, I need to mobilize all my muscles and blood vessels to get moving quickly, I would use the hormone adrenaline, aka epinephrine. That would go everywhere in my body, and that would get everything ready to run fast. So it's all about communication. That's why hormones and neurons are next to each other. So hormones are molecules. They can be as big as a single amino acid, which is really small. They can be polypeptides, which is a couple amino acids, or up to thousands of amino acids. They could be lipids, like like testosterone. So we're going to talk about those hormones. So a really important thing about hormones is negative feedback. So we'll do this with blood glucose levels, but you want to make sure everything's within normal limits. You don't want to have too much sugar, that's hyperglycemia. Too little blood sugar is hypoglycemia. So if you eat a candy bar and you put a bunch of sugar in your blood, you release the hormone insulin, and that drops it. That takes the glucose out of the blood to be stored as glycogen. And then the opposite, if you fall asleep and you don't eat for like 8 hours, your blood glucose is going to slowly drop as you use up that glucose. So then you produce a hormone called glucagon, and that says destroy the glycogen, right? Cut it up. Glycogen is just the long chain of glucose. Destroy the glycogen, put the glucose back into the blood. So it's all about making sure these levels don't get out of control. And that's negative feedback, which doesn't always mean decrease. It means just reverse whatever the level's doing. So if your body temperature is going up, negative feedback says sweat, and that'll bring you down. If your body temperature is going down, negative feedback says shiver, and that'll bring your body temperature back up. So that's negative feedback. And positive feedback is pretty rare. We'll talk about that with like childbirth, and that's it. All right, so let's do blood sugar first. We want to make sure you got the right amount of glucose. Too much glucose and your blood gets too syrupy, and there's a lot of problems that can happen with that. Too little glucose and your cells are going to starve. So we can have sugar as glucose in the bloodstream, and cells can get that very easily and feed themselves. If you have too much glucose, and we already mentioned this, you have the polysaccharide glycogen. So hopefully that sounds familiar. That's that alpha glucose polymer. So you put a bunch of alpha glucoses together, it makes a spiral. That's for storing excess sugar. So we have, now we're going to talk about the pancreas again. We already talked about the pancreas, super important in digestion, makes those 3 enzymes to help you digest food. And almost unrelated to that function, your pancreas also does blood sugar maintenance. It makes the messengers. So if you have too much sugar in your blood, that's the condition that we're familiar with our high sugar modern diet. You've heard of too much sugar in the blood. You've also heard of insulin. So if your blood sugar is going up too much, your pancreas gets the message, and it's like, we need to take out this glucose from the blood, store it as glycogen. So let's make insulin, and insulin goes to the liver, and then the liver says, oh, you got too much glucose, so let's grab the glucose, put it together inside of our cells instead of floating around in the bloodstream. And so that takes glucose out of the blood. So make sure you don't mix up where you make the insulin. It's made in the pancreas, and that's the beta cells. And where it works is the liver. So insulin's made in the pancreas and works in the liver. Make sure you don't mix those up. And then the opposite is a process you probably haven't heard of. If you have the opposite case where your blood sugar is too low, the alpha cells, right? This is the Greek letter alpha. This is the Greek letter beta. So the alpha cells of the pancreas, again, still a pancreas that's making these 2 different hormones that do opposite things. The alpha cells of the pancreas make glucagon. Okay, and make sure you pronounce this correctly and spell it correctly, because this looks a lot like glycogen, which are very different things. So glucagon is made when the glucose is gone. So when your glucose levels are too low, you make glucagon, and that says, liver, it's time to release your storages. So the glucagon goes to the liver, and the liver breaks up its glycogen storages and releases it back into the bloodstream. So insulin and glucagon do opposite things, right? Insulin takes the glucose out of the blood, and glucose says, put it back in. Okay, go to the liver, get rid of that glycogen, turn it back into glucose. Okay, so ways to remember this. It's alphabetical, although a really useful one is IB. If you just remember IB, insulin comes from the beta cells of the pancreas. Glucagon comes from the alpha cells. That's an easier way to remember it. Okay, and then if you're struggling with which hormone does which, you've heard of insulin. You've heard of it because we have too much sugar in our blood. So the high sugar one is insulin from the beta cells, IB. The low sugar hormone is glucagon from the alpha cells. Okay. So you're probably familiar with diabetes. This is the inability of insulin to take glucose out of the blood. The insulin is the messenger. It's the liver that physically takes the glucose out. So you have two types, and they're named based on how early in life you get them. You got type 1 diabetes, which is, there might be genetic components to it. We're still figuring it out. There might be some kind of infection that leads to it. We're still figuring it out. But type 1 diabetes is the one that you don't really have too much control over whether or not you get it as of now, as of what we understand. That's autoimmune. So lymphocytes, hopefully that sounds a little familiar from the immune system unit. Some lymphocytes got screwed up and they destroyed your beta cells of your pancreas, right? Insulin from beta cells of the pancreas. So the immune system destroyed the beta cells. You don't make insulin. So you have to really carefully monitor your blood sugar. Every time you eat, you measure your blood sugar levels and give yourself insulin if it's too high. The pancreas does this automatically, but if the beta cells are dead, you need to do that yourself. And then type 2 diabetes, this is the really common one now with our high sugar, high fat diets and lack of exercise. This is the adult onset where you still make insulin just fine, but your liver is over it. Decades of making so much insulin has caused an insensitivity to insulin. So there's a couple of ways to mention this. You don't respond to it, you're insensitive to the insulin, your liver's just over. It's like, okay, I'm done. I'm not responding to this insulin anymore. So you still make the insulin just fine, you just don't respond to it. And you can kind of manage it. There's no cure for these diseases, but they can be kind of managed. And a little picture there, but it's kind of complicated. All right, so that's it for blood sugar. And then next up is metabolism. Pretty simple. You got a thyroid in your neck. It makes thyroxine when you want to kick up your metabolism. So if you're cold, you kick up your metabolism, more reactions, more energy, more heat. Also, after you eat, body's like, we got all these calories, let's use them, make thyroxine. So that's pretty simple. Thyroxine from the thyroid. This next one, you have to understand what adipose tissue is. That's just any fat tissue. A fat cell, a cell that's specialized to store fat, is called an adipocyte, but you don't need to know that name. Adipose just means fat. So make sure you don't mix that up with aptos, adipose. So there's a hormone called leptin, and leptin, it's not really where the name comes from, but if you think of it as short for less appetite, like leptin, L-E-P-T, less appetite, leptin. So this one goes to the hypothalamus, which is one of the more primitive parts of your brain, and does negative feedback. So what happens is, let's say you eat more calories than you burn, and your body's, and it's more complicated than that, but you eat a bunch of calories and you don't work out as much, so your body's like, ooh, we got all these excess calories, let's store them as fat. And so you make more fat tissue. Fat tissue produces leptin. This is the only hormone we'll talk about where the hormone is made throughout the body. It's made in fat cells throughout your body. Everything, all the other hormones come from like special glands in specific parts. But leptin comes from throughout your body, all your fat tissue. So the more you eat, the more fat tissue you make to store those excess calories. And the more fat tissue you have, or adipose tissue, the more leptin you produce, and that makes you less hungry. So as you eat a bunch, you make fat cells that make leptin that make you less hungry. So they produce the thing that essentially destroys themselves. That makes sure you don't have too much of that. Okay, negative feedback. So this next slide should make a lot of sense based on what we talked about exactly about diabetes. So we did a study where can we take obese patients and give them leptin, make the leptin in a lab, and give them leptin to tell their hypothalamus to not be as hungry. Yeah. Okay. So the results are exactly what happens with diabetes. So we have two types of obesity. The main one is from an insensitivity to leptin. You just keep eating for decades. Food tastes so good in our modern diet that you just keep eating, and you create an insensitivity to leptin. Your hypothalamus is like, no, I'm going to ignore the leptin. So that's insensitive to it. So I did these in opposite order. So that's this last bullet point here. So with most obese patients, this was the case. They still made leptin. They were just insensitive to it. So giving them excess leptin didn't do anything. But in a small percentage of patients, they were obese because of a leptin deficiency, not an insensitivity, but a deficiency. Their adipose tissue had a mutation or didn't respond correctly and didn't produce leptin. So if you give them leptin, that would decrease their body fat percentage. Okay, because they were still responding to it, they just couldn't make it in high enough amounts. Okay, next one is a real quick one, circadian rhythm, which you've probably heard of. So this makes you sleepy. You just need to know the name of the hormone, melatonin, not to be confused with melanin. Melanin is the thing that makes things darker, like your hair and skin. Melatonin, it's got that toe in there, and the way I remember that is just like, I don't know, play with like your baby niece's toes and you go, ooh, sleepy toes. I don't know, that's horrible, but that's the best I can come up with. So the toe one is the sleepy one. Don't mix that up with melanin. So this is the one that's makes you sleepy. And what happens is you have your own internal clock. So you have this pineal gland, like kneeling into a pie for some reason. You got the pineal gland. This is the only time we'll ever talk about the pineal gland. The pineal gland makes melatonin. It's set. It's got 16 hours of not making it, 8 hours of making it. So when it makes melatonin, makes it at night, that makes you sleepy. So when the sun's out, the pineal's like, oh, sun's out, let's not make melatonin. Then the sun goes down and makes melatonin. But it has its own internal circadian rhythm. So if you then fly somewhere that has a different sunlight hours, you're in a different time zone, the pineal still has its own internal clock. And there's this lag between those two. So if you fly to like Australia, your pineal gland will still be making, for just for like a day or a couple days, will still be making melatonin on your previous light-dark cycle. It only moves a little bit every day. So yeah, it's not directly controlled by light and dark, but it's influenced by it. So you can push it in certain directions. And you can take melatonin for certain people. All right, let's talk about the reproductive system. We'll do male first. And yeah, I'm pretty immature, but I'll try to be professional here. So let's talk about males first. Testosterone comes from the testes, right? Those sound familiar for a reason. And testosterone does 3 things that you need to know. We got prenatal development. Hopefully you know already that nate means birth, like neonatal, newly born. Nativity scene is the birth. So we got prenatal development of male genitalia, and that happens at about day 60. Testosterone also says produce sperm in the testes after puberty, and also after puberty, development of secondary sexual characteristics, differentiating male versus female. Okay, so you need this drawn and labeled. Yeah, so you need this drawn and labeled. Important tubes here. We have the same tube that's called 2 different things based on where it is. So from the testes, we have the tube that takes the semen. It's not functional semen yet, but it takes the sperm from the testes up and around. and that's called the vas deferens. So when those get snipped, that's called a vasectomy. That's a common way if a male is done having children, they might get a vasectomy. You snip that. And then, yeah, so as it comes around, it joins up with the tube from the bladder and becomes the urethra. So the urethra is where semen and urine come out. So the testes, singular of testes is testis, which you don't need to know, but that's hilarious, I guess. So we got the testes make sperm. They also make testosterone, which you do need to know. So the testes make sperm and testosterone. The epididymis, which is this tiny little series of tubes on the top of the testes, they store the sperm until they can develop motility. So whereas you learn to swim at maybe the community pool, your sperm cells learn to swim in the epididymis. So if we ever build a pool in Scotts Valley, we should call it epididymis. Anyway, so you got the vas deferens for this. That's also called the sperm duct. A duct is just the tube. And then we got two glands that both pour stuff into the vas deferens to make it functional semen. You have the seminal vesicle, seminal meaning semen related. And we have the prostate gland, which you may have heard of in terms of like prostate cancer or something. So only males have a prostate, and it sits right on top of this tube, and when it becomes inflamed, that can push on the urethra and make problems with peeing. So that's why sometimes older males have problems urinating or have to go all the time, because the prostate becomes inflamed. Sits right there. So those two glands work together. Okay? All right, so that's it for males. Now let's talk about females. We have, whereas males, you only need to know one hormone. We got testosterone. For females, we're going to talk about a total of 4 hormones. It's going to be FSH, estrogen, LH, and progesterone. For now, you just need to know the 2 that you've probably heard of, estrogen and progesterone. Those are responsible for the secondary sexual characteristics, just like testosterone in males. And estrogen and progesterone come from the ovaries, whereas testosterone comes from the testes. So testes are like functionally equivalent to ovaries. All right, so these are the components of the female reproductive system you need to know. We have 2 ovaries, 2 fallopian tubes, 1 uterus in the middle, the cervix, which is also called the birth canal, and then the vagina is the external opening. So the ovaries are for egg and hormone production. So the eggs would be produced and developed within the ovary, and they go that way. This is the fallopian tube winding this way. This little piece of tissue here is just to connect the ovary, so it's not just floating around. That's not where the eggs actually go. That's just connective tissue. We got the fallopian tube for fertilization. So those both start with an F. Should be easy to remember. That's where the sperm cell and the egg cell would actually fuse together to make the zygote, and then it would divide into an embryo. And then the uterus, also known as the womb, that is where the baby develops. Okay, and in this picture here, the uterine lining has been built up. So we have a thick uterine lining ready to receive an embryo. If you're early in the menstrual cycle, this would be a lot thinner, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, cervix is the birth canal. So if you hear so-and-so is 6 centimeters dilated, that's the birth canal widening in preparation for childbirth. Okay. So 2 things have to happen at the same time. The rest of this lecture is about the menstrual cycle, and 2 things need to happen at the same time. We need the lining of the uterus, which is called the endometrium, to develop, to thicken, to get ready to receive an embryo, and that's called implantation, when the embryo implants into the uterus and gets stuck there. And then we also need the egg to be developed. So we need egg development and release from the ovary, and we need the endometrium to thicken basically at the same time. So that's what all these hormones are all about. So you need to know that endometrium is the lining of the uterus. Endo means inside. So you have the uterus, and that's the inner lining. Endo means inside. And yeah, that's got to be correlated with the egg release. So we have 4 hormones, and the acronym is FELP, F-E-L-P. So take whatever song that has help and get it stuck in your head as FELP. So you can think of the Beatles songs like, FELP, I need somebody now. Anyway, so we're going to go FSH, and then estrogen, and then LH, and then progesterone. That's what the PHELP stands for. You don't need to know what FSH and LH stand for. In case you're curious, this is follicle stimulating hormone. The follicle is what helps the egg develop. So this stimulates the follicle to stimulate the egg to develop. And then LH, L stands for luteinizing, which means yellowing. It's poorly named because after you release, LH is what releases the egg from the ovary. After you release the egg from the ovary, some left behind cells look yellow. It's stupid. Okay. Anyway, so we got feedback mechanisms. We got positive feedback mechanisms where both things are going to build up at the same time. And we have negative feedback where one thing going up is going to cause the other to go down. So you can think of it as like correlation, positive correlation or negative correlation. Okay. So we'll talk about this picture at the end. All right. So we'll go in order of PHELP. So the first one is FSH, and that gets the egg ready. And it comes from the pituitary, which is a gland in your brain. So the abbreviated hormones, FSH and LH, come from the brain, come from the pituitary, which is this tiny little gland in the middle. And they work on the egg. And then the unabbreviated hormones, estrogen and progesterone, come from the ovary and work on the endometrium. And the endometrium is that lining of the uterus. Okay, so these are the first two hormones. FSH and estrogen. FSH gets the egg ready. Estrogen gets the endometrium ready. And then the last two hormones are LH and progesterone. And LH, now that the egg has gotten ready from FSH, LH says release the egg from the ovary. Okay? And then the last hormone is progesterone. And progesterone says maintain the endometrium. So if the woman gets pregnant, we want that endometrium there the entire time, the entire 40 weeks. So progesterone levels stay high during the entirety of pregnancy. But if there is no fertilization, no implantation, no sperm cell has united, has fused with the egg cell, these progesterone levels are going to fall. And once the progesterone levels fall, without progesterone, the endometrium gets shed. And that is what menstruation is. Okay, so something I didn't really focus on is the positive and negative feedback. So if you just remember PHELP, it'll be easy to remember what does positive feedback. F does positive on E, E does positive on L, L does positive on P, so that's PHELP. And then the only negative feedback is progesterone shutting down the pituitary. So the progesterone goes to the endometrium and says, stay, okay, don't get shed, be ready for a embryo to implant. And then the progesterone also goes to the pituitary in the brain saying, don't make FSH and LH. These are the two egg hormones, right? If you've already produced LH, right? If we're on the fourth hormone, we've already made LH, we've already released one egg. We don't want to keep making these guys and release more and more eggs. Okay, you always want to release one egg. And then if two eggs get released or multiple eggs get released, then you have fraternal twins. With modern medicine, that's not a big deal. But if you think about evolutionary history, the mother is more likely to die in childbirth if you have a bunch of twins or triplets. So that's why it makes sense to shut these hormones off once you've already released one egg. Okay? So what does this mean? It goes F, E, L, P. So you can see the F levels. I mean, there's kind of a spike there, but it's high at the beginning. So F, E, L, P. Okay, so that's them spiking in the correct order. So FSH and LH both work on the egg, and the egg is in the ovary. That's what this ovarian cycle means. And then estrogen and progesterone work on the endometrium. So this is the uterus. This is the lining of the uterus. Those cells building up and getting sloughed off. So these come from the pituitary. These come from the ovary. Okay. All right. So how to remember? You got PHELP. Make sure you get that in the correct order. The abbreviated hormones go together. The unabbreviated hormones go together. FSH and LH from the brain working on the egg. Estrogen and progesterone from the ovary working on the endometrium. So FSH is first, and that stimulates egg development. Estrogen establishes the endometrium. This isn't a great one, but LH, loose the egg. Like, loose is what you yell at archers to get them to shoot. And then progesterone prolongs the endometrium, or prepares, either of those. Cool. So last thing is in vitro fertilization. So I mentioned earlier you want to produce 1 egg per menstrual cycle, but let's say we want the woman is having a difficult time getting pregnant. We might do in vitro fertilization, and in vitro should be italicized because it's Latin. Vitro means like lab. The opposite of this would be in vivo. So vivo, vivere, to live in a life form. So in vitro fertilization, we take a bunch of eggs from the woman and we fuse them with sperm cells in a petri dish. Okay, so for whatever reason, the sperm cells aren't making it to the egg cells and fusing, so let's take that out of the fallopian tube, take it out of the living organisms, and do it in a lab. Okay, so you give a bunch of drugs to stop the menstrual hormones, and it's a variety that you can use, but it's one of those hormones, probably progesterone, usually progesterone. And then you give, so once the normal menstrual cycle has been disrupted, you give a bunch of FSH and LH, because we don't want endometrium, right? We don't need estrogen, progesterone, we don't need endometrium, we just want a bunch of eggs. So this is called superovulation. So we put a cape on the ovary, like a superhero, superovulation. Okay. And then we get a bunch of eggs, fuse them in a lab, and we can't, you can't implant zygotes. A zygote is just one cell. It's not going to implant into the endometrium. So you have to grow it into embryos in a petri dish, and then you implant the embryos into a surrogate mother. So if you guys have heard of Octomom, she had octuplets. The doctor who put a ton of embryos that was all by IVF. The doctor who put a bunch of embryos into her uterus lost his license and maybe got arrested. I know California law is up to 3 embryos at a time. Usually do multiple because it's not 100% chance. Okay? And then I think this is the last thing in here. We got Bill Harvey again. He was the blood guy. He's also the deer uterus guy. So this little nature of science things. This is in the 1600s. We knew about cells, but our microscopes weren't great, so we could just barely tell that there were cells present here. He knew that you didn't even know what a sperm cell was. He just knew that semen from a man getting close to an egg cell baby, somehow. But he wasn't stupid. It's just the microscopes weren't good enough to actually see the sperm cell. So you knew there was some weird thing going on with the semen, but he couldn't predict that it was actual fusion of the male and the female cell. Anyway, so this is a useful table for all that. Okay, and then I'll leave you on your own to do these questions.